Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to the dissertation defense of Mr. Bradford McCall. It is a privilege and a sign of his intellect and person that so many people have joined this dissertation defense. What we ask is that everybody turn off their camera and mute so that you'll be able to see the examiners and the examinee. And I will place a pen on each of them as well, so that you'll be able to see them. If you do unmute or leave your camera on, I will just go ahead and turn your camera off for you and mute you so that we're able to proceed. I'm finding the person. Bradford, you're set. Let me put a pin here. Okay, so if you set your view to gallery, or sorry, to speaker, you should be able to see the committee. And I'll need to find out who's not muted yet.
Are you going to be recording this, Dr. Clayton?
We are already recording. Okay,
excellent.
I muted Susan Brown, and I'm turning off Karen Cody's camera, and I think we are set now. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is a ritual which goes back roughly to the founding of the University of Paris, at least that far, arguably back to the Centennial several centuries earlier. So that would be 1205, where the academy confers or does not confer on an individual the highest degree that the academy has to offer, the Doctor of Philosophy. And Mr. Bradford McCall is now beginning that centuries-old ritual today. It allows 3 PhDs who are specialists in the fields in which he writes to have about half an hour each to ask any question that they wish. A book cited, and he has hundreds and hundreds of books cited, or a book not even mentioned, or a concept not even mentioned in the dissertation. And it is the process by which this particular institution declares a person to be a peer and competent to profess weighty words for the rest of his or her career. So with that, it's often the ritual that the advisor poses the first question so that the individual has a chance to sort of warm up and get used to it. But Bradford declined that offer. So that allows us to move directly to the panel. And before Professor Ingolf Dahlfert begins his questions, Professor Roland Faber now has the chair. Dr. Faber.
Good morning, Bradford.
Good morning, Dr. Faber. Yes.
It's good to see you again. Some time has passed since we last time were in physical contact, and obviously in writing I saw you until recently. So I'm glad you made it to this point, and I think it's an interesting conversation that could come out of this book that you were writing, and I'm referring to it as a book. It's a dissertation, obviously, but you are already a published author, and so it seems to be one of your next books, so to say, that you just you fit in the PhD, so to say, in your book publishing career in some way. So I'm pleased to say that I like your scholarship. You're meticulous in these matters, and the way you go through literature shows a broad interest and understanding and knowledge of the material that you are addressing. And so basically what I want to do is to ask you a few more fundamental questions. I don't want to go into specific details. They might come up at a certain moment, but generally, I would like to see you as a scholar on these matters. How you, in a conversation with me, in a sense, kind of explain to me what you were doing and why you were doing what you were doing, right? So these are kind of the more fundamental points that I want to raise for you to speak freely about, and then I will ask specific questions if they come up. So since the chair has not asked an introductory question, and since you refused obviously to give us an introduction, I will make you do it in the sense like, so why So
Sorry, Bradford, did you prepare an opening
I
comment?
did, in fact, yes. Yes.
Then that is, Dr. Faber is
no,
correctly
he has
pointed
not
out.
to read it or whatever, but I just, my question would be, and that kind of feeds into this, and you can just speak freely and give me 1 or 2 or 3 thoughts on it. Why did you write this book? I mean, why did you write on evolution? What is it that you are fascinated by, or the problem that you want to solve? What is the level of uncertainty, and maybe also of a certain uneasiness with the question of evolution that kind of drags you into it to go so deep as you wanted to go through it?
Well, I will begin by, of course, referencing what I noted in my preface. That I was very mad at I abhorred the notion of a loving God. Right, I was raised in a Southern Baptist home. As a little preface here, I was raised in a Southern Baptist home in which the God of Southern Baptist belief was, of course, presented as all powerful, all knowing, all controlling, etc. Well, then my accident occurred, right, of 1995, which I will not elaborate upon. I've done so in the book or in the dissertation itself, so I'll not elaborate upon it further. But nevertheless, then the accident occurred, and I was mad at everybody, mad at you, who I didn't know you, of course, but I was mad at you, Dr. Clayton, Dr. Faber, Dr. Dalford, etc. Everybody, but mostly at the loving God that my then current context, of course, presented to me. Well, in sort of a I guess response to my aversion to that concept of the loving God that I was raised under, I then pursued biology in college. Well, of course, that floored me, that hammered me, so to speak, intellectually as well as, I guess you could say, professionally, in a sense, right? But in that, I discovered a way to undo my teachings regarding the loving God of the past. So I then profess atheism, of course. Well, that then of course, with my experience of meeting God in the cotton field, as I explained in 2000, I then tried to use my former atheistic biological training in a positive way to advance the faith, I guess you could say, right? So so I've been working in the last 20 some odd years, 21 years, I guess, thereabout, to integrate my former biology training with my current faith context, if that makes sense, sir. Did I adequately address your questions there, Dr. Faber?
Yeah, that's a very personal read and as a background. Now, so that leads me to my next question in this regard.
Roland, can I ask a question? Should we have Bradford present his written open remark? That was my error not to do that before, or do you want to, at some point we need to allow him to do that, but you can decide.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, let him go ahead. That's fine. Sure.
Okay, excellent. Bradford, why don't you go ahead and then we'll turn back to Professor Faber.
Very well.
Also, can I point out there's some microphone background noise as if you're bumping your computer with notes or papers or something. So if it's possible to be careful about that.
Okay, very well. Well, greetings, Professors Clayton, Dalford, and Faber, alphabetical order, of course. In the next roughly 5 minutes, I will enunciate the key points of my dissertation, which itself amounted to one long argument in a la, of course, Gould, and then even before that, a la Darwin. By me, that is. I will begin by noting that it was not, and is not my intention to defend any of the positions that I employ in this dissertation or the book, which means that I will not defend any of the individuals that I employ in this book, period. Rather, I've employed parts of these people's positions, so to speak. I've culled from them what I wanted to, right, as conversation partners, as is, meaning that defending their particular viewpoints, which I don't want to get into, would take me too far afield in this dissertation defense. So what are these ideas and views of my own that I just referenced? Well, allow me please to start with the preface. I therein asserted that contingency marks every area and arena of our lives. And then I delineated 7 instances in my own life that substantiate the promulgation by this book of its contingentist viewpoint, of which I then in later chapters applied to my perception of the evolutionary advance. Moreover, in this preface, I noted why, skipping down through that, why I abhor the notion of a loving God, right? I then noted the consequences of me later encountering Ord's theological reflections on the full-orbed, uncontrolling love of God. Indeed, with Ord, I asserted that God did and does not control the entities in the natural world, that is, the responses to overtures of God's love, which I term erotic love, which I'll get to later. Further, I asserted that though it befuddled me, the Godhead more potently loves me, and that undeniably and uncontrollingly. I then referred to what I called God's enormous, amorously potent, empowering love. These points, of course, set the tone for what followed in the dissertation itself. The first bold assertion made by me in the dissertation was that I do not think humans per se are created imago Dei, or in the image of God, you could say. Rather, I asserted that all entities instead are derived in the image of God, so to speak, because all entities, animate or not, display hints of sentience. I then noted my overall thesis for the project is that my panentheistic theology from below methodology provides a plausible philosophical and scientific framework for viable construction of the imago Dei, or the image of God. Such a panentheistic theology from below methodology also, I argued, presents new ways of considering divine involvement, as I term it. Indeed, thereafter, that contention is then informed by an interdisciplinary framework that accounts for historical evolutionary biology perspectives through Darwin, and then engages constructively with contemporary practitioners of evolutionary biology, that is through Gould, Roos, and Conway Morris. Then it was enriched by Peirce's evolutionary developmental teleology, as I've termed it, in so much as that evolutionary developmental teleology is constituted by an original view of causation by Peirce, that each occurrence of this causation involves an efficient, a final, and a chance component. The argument then climaxed with the theological appropriation based upon Ord's work, 2015 and 2007, of full-orbed, uncontrolling love of God. In conjunction with my own views regarding the more potent love of God. This more potent love of God, I then asserted, works with and within a largely contingentist evolutionary worldview. I think I'll stop there. Right. That's my couple of minutes there.
Thank you, Bradford. That's really helpful. Sorry I didn't let you begin with that earlier. And we return to Professor Faber.
Yes, so Bradford, my next question was, and it kind of feeds into this kind of general setup of your dissertation. Why do you think, so in your opinion, that theology has to engage evolution?
Why do I think theology has to engage evolution, you ask, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I do. I think there are numerous manners in which I could respond to that question, Dr. Faber. Indeed, for example, one, I would say that theology has to, needs necessarily so to speak, interact with evolution, because evolution has become the sine qua non, that is the default, so to speak, interpretation of the advance of humans or hominoids in the natural world, in so much as it has replaced, you could say, a general theistic view of the derivation of humans, in a sense. Does that accurately address your question, Dr. Faber?
So in a sense, what you always address my question, so that you don't have to ask it. That's fine. It's like it's always like part of an answer, obviously, right? That comes to your mind right now. But so in a sense, like is who gains, right? Are you doing this because you think theology as an existing discipline relating to a certain kind of understanding of reality, philosophically and religiously, has to engage evolution for its own sake, right? Because it needs to kind of adapt to a time in which that is, as you say, prevalent. Or is it also for the sake of science to do so, that you engage, obviously here? Who wins, who gains by it, and who needs to do it? Why do we, what's the need, so to say, right? Why can't I come up and say, well, as an evolutionary theorist, it's fine what you say. I mean, it's okay, interesting. Okay, so you cover the field. Everything that science says you agree on, right? There is chance and whatever, and there's certain theories of how much chaos plays a role, or chance or contingency plays a role in it. But I don't need your theological explanation. So that kind of mindset would say that theology answers it for itself, right? It engages evolution because it needs to kind of redo its face or redo its theory in the context of it? Or is there something in your opinion, in your writing, right, on it, that you think you tell also the scientific discussion that will be of importance to it? You mentioned final causation, right? Is there some kind of aim that is reached through such a theological discussion for the scientific understanding of evolution?
Is there something? Very well. Well, I think that going back to what I covered in my dissertation, that of course a reference of, for example, Ian Barber's, I almost said Ian, but Ian Barber's book entitled Religion and Science, which goes back to the 70s, I do believe, the late 70s. On these dates, I might be a little off because my memory does not work in that manner, but nevertheless, he indicated that there were four main ways that theology interacts with science, so to speak. I'm
just interested in what you think, right? You tell what is your outcome of that discussion, right? You don't have to recover it. I know that you know it. It's not about knowledge. I really want to know what you think.
Okay. Well, I would, if I had to choose one of those four options by Barber, conclude that I am an integrationist, although I have reservations with his depiction of that, which I demonstrate. So then, in the sense of being an integrationist, I contend that there, in some way, both theology and science can mutually interact in a way that is productive or fruitful, you could say, to both domains of inquiry. Does that make sense? Okay,
yes.
right.
So what in your book, what in your dissertation, what in your understanding now is it that you integrate? What is the integration that happens here?
Okay, right. Well, I integrate. Well, and again, I don't like using that terminology per se because I don't agree with Barber's classification. I don't, but
I don't mind. This is, yeah.
Okay, right. But nevertheless, what do I integrate, so to speak, from theology and science, or theology and science together? Very well. Well, I integrate scientific perspectives, which are undoubtedly true. And then I also integrate theological perspectives, which I then overlay upon that scientific interpretation, so to speak. Now, again, that means that I don't take the Bible literally, but I take the Bible literally as possible, so to speak. But at the end of the day, my science trumps a literal interpretation of the Bible, because after all, the Bible was not meant to be a scientific textbook. Rather, it was meant to be, of course, a recollection of God's involvement with the nation of Israel. Right, and it's got to be seen through the lens in which it was constructed, not from modern scientific lens, but I take the essence of that story, that being that God desires some sort of relationship with entities, one, and then some sort of, then he also has some sort of goal or telos for the world, and of course at the eschaton, two, and then three, that somehow God somehow in a very ambiguous sense works with what I term creation in quotation marks, because I don't believe the world was created per se, but I use that terminology in order to be consistent with the tradition. Then in some sense, like I said, God works with his creation to eventuate the goals that he has for that creation, which is, of course, nothing more than the derivation of sentience. Right.
So yeah, I try once more, like what difference would it, so this is a difference that would make for the restructuring of a theology or a philosophy in the context of evolutionary theory, but what do you think that you can, what do you tell the science, what do you tell the scientists, right? What difference does it make, you think, your work, right? Not in general, right? For your findings, so to say, for the development of the scientific understanding of evolution.
Okay. Now, what do I think it tells the science? My theological overlay, what does it tell the science? Well, it tells the science that it could explain, it can adequately explain things that happen today and things that happened maybe yesterday, so to speak, and maybe things that might be projected in the future, but it cannot explain, for example, the origin of, or the origination, you could say, of these processes in general. That necessarily looks back to the involvement of a divine entity, of course, right? Because of course, causality in science always works from the previous to the future. Well, in that sense, of course, it can't go back ad nauseum. It reaches a point, a centripetal point, to where science can no longer produce adequate answers. Does that make sense at all?
Well, so you are telling science. So if you pose a certain understanding of God or a certain theological understanding of origination of the world, the universe, to evolutionary science, you think that you tell evolutionary theory something that would make a difference for them.
Something that will make a difference for them.
Yeah, I mean, does it? In what way does it kind of? Okay, so if I hear what you say in your dissertation, right, as a evolutionary biologist, and I say, wow, okay, so that means for me a change in my method or in my set of ideas or in my philosophical way to approach evolution, which has maybe an influence of my findings and so on. Is that what happens? Do you think that's what's happening? So you can tell the scientific theory something that that's new, maybe that's different, and that could be integrated in the scientific perspective, methodologically or also empirically, or a theory, or not, right? Are you saying this?
That's what you're asking me. Okay, I think I've got a little better understanding of what you're asking me. No, I do not think that anything I promulgate will impact the day-to-day activities of a scientist. However, moving from the day-to-day activities empirically, you could say, of a scientist, moving from that to a philosophical overlay of what those empirical findings mean, I think then my application or my dissertation would have application to that, sir. Yes.
Right, but okay, so I take it as you say. So it seems to me it makes a difference for theology, not for science, really. What you say, right? Or for the scientist as a human being, and it's unclear in what sense the philosophy of science is impacted by what you say at this point. To me, so it's just three thoughts, and that's okay. I'm just memorizing certain points that I find interesting or open for discussion. Let me move on a little bit here. So you choose, when you began, I remember these discussions that the question of contingency was for you very important in the sense of widening up and make it almost omnipotent in a sense, right? Contingency becomes omnipotent. Or omnipresent, right? To use all these divine epithets. And you were kind of, it seems to be in the position more with the uniqueness of, so evolution doesn't repeat itself, like a Gould position over against the convergency theory that you know, Conway Morris and others propose from a scientific perspective, and interestingly also from a philosophical one. But the inclusion of person, and also your ending with your theological concept that you include, seems to be indicating that you not that you would include finality, right, and final causation, and therefore that it is not a pure repetition. So a pure it's not a pure kind of irrepeatable process, right? Because there's some finality to it in which there's a conversion happening, at least from a philosophical perspective, if not from a scientific one. So have you moved away from this original idea to expand the chaotic moment, at least experimentally, to everything, to a position that is more on convergence, at least in a philosophical sense, if not in a scientific sense, and specifically, obviously, in a theological sense, as you talk about finality and teleology in this context. So would you kind of, how would you situate yourself in this kind of scientific discussion, as it is also a philosophical one, right,
Okay.
between Gould and Morris, let's say?
Okay, well, as I indicated in the dissertation, I do dialogue, of course, with Conway Morris, and I take from him the idea that all entities cannot escape their history, right? Because of course, the history of derivation includes such things as their developmental and genetic pathways, right? And although Gould, for example, contends that all things are contingent, his radically contingent disposition, I sort of softened that with Conway Morris's advocation of convergence. However, I then critiqued Conway Morris based on his lack of distinction between homologies, between parallelism and true convergence, right? So I do not think that Conway Morris at all accounts for homology, nor does it account for the differentiation between convergence and parallelism, right?
Okay, so are you accepting that there's at least some kind of probability space in which certain things will be beyond chaotic possibility, be realizable in an evolutionary process or not?
Anything beyond a probability space.
No, are you thinking that there is a probability space in which something is more likely, therefore it's not just a chaotic possibility to be realized, so a certain kind of probability spaces in which certain ways of pathways will be more realizable than others? That makes sense. It's Conway Morris kind of idea.
I do in fact contend that, but not for the reasons that Conway Morris does. Conway Morris of course contemplates the idea of convergence, but like I said earlier in my previous response, he does not distinguish between parallelism and convergence. Parallelism, however, is what I advocate, right? Which indicates, of course, as we know, all entities in the world, or all organisms in the world, what have you, all entities I prefer, have a shared genetic basis, right? They have a shared genetic, I guess you could say, language, right? And well, convergence indicates that bipolar opposites of lines of evolution can meet together in similar morphology. However, parallelism contends that most instances of this apparent convergence in nature, or the apparent convergences in nature, occur because they have underlying regulators, underlying genetic regulators that direct so to speak, the outcomes, right? I'm not sure if that makes sense at all to you.
Yeah, I leave it there. So I think it's a very interesting idea to see empirical evidence that certain functions, for instance, of organs, come out of very different contexts, right? And from very different pathways to actually, because of other constraints, natural constraints, kind of lead to similar outcomes, like the development of the eye and other organs and stuff like this, right? I think that's something to be accounted for, and even go beyond the Earth and ask the question about life in the universe, and whether there is a similar constraint on it or not. And therefore, my question was kind of regarding how much you think there are such constraints, because they represent some kind of finality in a theological, philosophical sense, or final causation in some way. Although they don't need to, from a scientific basis, they seem to indicate something like this. But let me move on a little bit further here, if I may, in this line of questioning, and then I stop here and go somewhere else. If I still have time, Philip, I don't want to kind of take it away. I can come back later also. Namely, so the way you formulated it at the beginning, your kind of thesis, how you set it up, and also how you represented it now in your little statement, is in many ways, if I hear it, like if I know it, very similar to a Whiteheadian understanding of things. And this is close to my heart, right? You kind of partly avoided that in the dissertation, which is okay, because there are different pathways, right? There's a convergence happening here on a philosophical basis, but you choose another person in this sense for certain philosophical elements to be brought in, final causation, for instance, and others. But while at the same time staying true to your contingencies view, which invited this creativity and the consequences of it, or the sentient character of every being and stuff like this. It's a totally Whiteheadian kind of background to it. So why did you choose Peirce over Whitehead? Is kind of a personal question of your philosophical kind of situatedness.
Very well. Well, I will first answer this question by going back to the one you previously asked that I didn't get to respond to. And that is that I do believe there are constraints in nature, but these constraints are not superimposed by Platonic realms. These constraints are not even superimposed by God. Rather, these constraints are instead a direct result of the developmental pathways of organisms, and that based on history, of course, that based on their historical derivation. Right. But then moving on to your current question regarding why did I choose Peirce over Whitehead, I have a sneaky suspicion, Dr. Faber, that Whitehead's own views were influenced by Peirce. Now, I can't substantiate that right now, but I don't want to get you to challenge me on that, because I'm not prepared to defend that. But because Peirce preceded Whitehead, and because Whitehead definitely read Peirce, I wanted to say that, well, I just said it. I think Whitehead's views are derived from Peirce, but I don't want to defend that. I'm just asserting it instead, and that may be a logical error on my part, because you are, of course, a Whiteheadian scholar, but nevertheless, yeah, that's my best answer heretofore for that question.
Yeah, I suppose there's also a certain kind of philosophical taste in the background that might be the case, and there are others have worked on Peirce and Whitehead and have moved between them, in a sense. Whether they are, historically and how much they're related is another question. And so you choose the earlier before the later, in a sense, right? And you see the influence line, but then also in evolution, later developments cannot be necessarily deducted from the earlier ones. That's the part of contingency. So if that is the case, then if there's a reception process, then Whitehead would maybe bring something in that's different from Peirce, and also in a developed sense should be recognized, right? I think. But I'm fine with you choosing Peirce. I'm not saying you should, it's fine, but I'm saying, like, taking your own way of thinking, right, of contingency and the novelty that Whitehead proposes for every kind of philosophical development, there's something to be considered that cannot be kind of deduced and led back to the earlier one, right? From the later to the earlier one, although there are some things that lead forward to it. So I would say it is an area to at least also conceptually to engage, because it gives you some kind of instrument that you just leave consciously out if you don't do so, right? In a sense. Let me move on to something else, to another area. I would ask you a little bit more about kenosis. So you're consciously using this concept as an important one for the outcome of your understanding of God's action in the world. It's obviously an old concept, as you know, and there, you know, if it is about the kind of mutuality between God and the world as sentience, if you want, right? It goes back to the antiquity. Origen and Theodore of Lautréamont and others kind of have talked about even the suffering of the Father and so on. And then there are these, throughout history, there are waves in which that concept plays a big role in the 19th century in English theology, and then in German theology, obviously in the 20th century. Almost in the sense to an annihilation of God, almost in a sense at certain points, or American theology also. So you are differentiating yourself. You're not saying this. You don't want to go into many of these ways to interpret kenosis. But there is a wide field out there of such interpretations and use of that concept. So what in your use of that concept differentiates you from others, right? Or you know, if you say no, then I would say, what is novel? Why would you kind of bring it in as something? It seems to be at certain points in your writing that nobody else has really thought about yet, right? So
that's a very interesting question, Dr. Faber. Truly it is. Now, whereas I ignorantly perhaps assert that I do have some originality with the notion of kenosis, that being, of course, ordinarily pictured as throughout all Christian history, most of Christian history anyway, being perceived as the self-emptying of Christ on the cross. Well, I declare by historical exegesis, which I show in this dissertation, as well as in previous publications going all the way back to 2008, that instead of being merely a self-abnegation or self-emptying, kenosis should be pictured as a self-offering, I guess you could say a self-donation, in feeling, even you could say, by God into the world, right? And of course, I apply that by my notion of the self-giving, to use a more developed thesis, the self-giving love of God, which is, of course, expressed in the imbibification, of, or I coined, by the way, of the Spirit into matter. Which, what I mean by imbibification is to go back to the Latin root of imbibere or imbibera, or what I can't pronounce it, but nevertheless, go back to the Latin imbibere, which of course connoted a soaking into, or even a absorption of something into another something, not imbibing in the sense of drinking something, which is our usual implication or usual meaning of imbibing, but instead in the sense of absorbing the Spirit into matter instead, or assimilating the Spirit into matter. So then, working from that notion, kenosis would be the idea that God poured himself out into matter. And I make very good, I think anyway, biblical arguments that kenosis should mean self pouring out of something. For example, I reference, I think it was Rebecca's mentioning, or the mentioning in Genesis 24 of Rebecca and her pouring the water out into the trough, which is of course translated into the Septuagint by the term I'm going to mutilate it, but ekinison or what have you, which shows its reliance upon the term kenosis. So then I conclude that the proper meaning, I guess you could say, or the original meaning of kenosis was, of course, something being poured out into another something. Well, I claim that God's kenosis of the Spirit led to him pouring out the Spirit into matter, right? And then matter imbibified, if you will, using a conjugation there with the Spirit, then advanced into the complexities we have today. I'm not sure if I had a.
You don't have to ask. You always answer somehow my question, right? That's fine. It's always a way to do it. So obviously there's the ebullition. There's this term of pouring out in Meister Eckhart, and in a mystical kind of context, in Kabbalistic context, you find this idea of pouring out also, and that almost like the biblical idea of like water that's poured out and cannot be recovered again, right? You find this idea, and that kind of would fit your understanding of contingency in a sense, right? It's really left out. You might know or not, right, that what you say about pouring out was a central concept of Karl Rahner, and the self-communication of God was meant for him to be exactly that's the only thing that really is, right? That's this process, and he made this point even in the context of biology and Christology in the 60s and 70s with this idea of mind towards matter, right? And matter as frozen spirit, if you want, right? Kind of the same kind of move here, although he did think that kenosis is not a concept that should be used in this context, right? So he was the opposite here. Like he was opposed to it, although he was totally for what you say with self-giving. So that's an interesting kind of controversy. So you can do what you do without going into the kenosis question, or even oppose it for theological reasons. Like Karl Rahner was making the case that what does it help to be emptied out if God becomes the same as us in this sense, like who is helped by it, right? It's just God is sitting in the same dirt as we. That's it. So kind of Rahner was making this is not working for him, but. You might also not know that I have actually written a book in 1995 that has the title Selbsteinsatz Gottes, which means actually something like self-giving, self-donation, or something like this. Philip could translate it. It cannot be translated Einsatz, Selbsteinsatz, but it goes in this direction. So I mean, what I'm saying is, all right, on the one hand, the idea of self-giving is an old idea too. So what is your new spin on it, right? And secondly, there are others who talk very much about self-giving, but are not avoiding kenosis as a concept.
Okay. What's new about my proposal? Well, I go back to, again, 2008, when I, of course, published online. It was a peer-reviewed journal article online. Nevertheless, I'm not going to get into that. But nevertheless, I argued that kenosis equals effectively an infilling of God into the world, which thereby onset the panentheistic relationship that I argue for throughout the dissertation in the world, or of the world. That is, that God is in the world thoroughly, fully, completely, and 100%, but that he's also something else as well. That is, of course, his more than aspect, I guess you could say, the panentheism. Right. So what would be original about my take on kenosis, to get back to your question? Well, I think that kenosis is, in fact, a pouring out of God, of a kenosis of the Spirit, so to speak, or rather, I think kenosis is depicted by God's kenosis of the Spirit into the natural world, which gave rise to the panentheistic orientation, which further generates in a. And I note that I border upon almost a, I guess you could say, a pantheism. I mean, I border upon that. I do indeed, because I contend that through God's kenosis of Spirit into the world, the Spirit contains the Spirit, or this should say that the world contains the Spirit throughout its evolutionary advance. So then, but at the same time, in keeping with panentheism, I contend that God is more than that. So I guess my original contribution, so I'm meandering here, but nevertheless, please give me the grace to go on. Is that the panentheistic, or rather, is that God's kenosis of Spirit into matter, that is the pouring out of matter, in the pouring out of Spirit into matter, onsets the evolutionary advance. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not.
So I will only say, I will move on to a last question. But I will say that Karl Rahner was making even a more radical point by saying that he sides with pantheism rather than theism on this point, right? So, that would be an interesting kind of context for your understanding of panentheism. But my last question goes towards your understanding of love. So the self outpouring is obviously often related to the biblical concept of agape, but you favor eros, like Whitehead did.
Yes.
In fact, right? He was not against agape, but was favoring this term's translation of love of God as eros at certain points. And my question is why, right? Or let me specify a little more. So your whole idea of outpouring is like an origination move, right? It comes from origination to like a contingent, like a thorough contingency of the world that is the outcome of it, right? While eros is a concept that is traditionally being seen as problematic in a theological context because it seems to indicate a lack. Although I don't understand it this way, Whitehead wouldn't, and I think Plato doesn't when he uses this term, because it is a fulfillment of its internal potential, right? So it's kind of something that is really what final causation is about. It's an attraction, right? It's attraction to the good, for instance. That's what it means. So there's it's an opposite move in a sense. It's not origination, but it's kind of this attraction that comes with it. How do you mediate that when you lay your interest is much more understanding of kenosis, origination, pouring out, but then you favor eros as, which is actually in a sense the opposite or a contrast to that term.
Well, I would like to qualify your contention there by noting that in my ideas, at least in my most developed ideas, I contend that due to the amplification of spirit into matter, or that which we've already covered, that matter then has its own erotic desires, you could say, right? So and what I mean by erotic desires is not anything inflammatory, and anything, of course, that we often attribute to eros or erotic in the world today, but rather that that all entities, because they have erotic desires or longings, are internally driven, impelled, you might say, by a desire to reach higher levels of complexification. That's how I simply integrate the eros there, indeed.
Right. So is that something that they lacked before, and therefore potential, just a potential? And where's the potential coming from? Isn't that potential already a predisposition, and therefore, in a sense, a limitation or a constraint on them? And therefore, maybe there is contingency that is under the skin already. Coming back to the Platonic that you said at the beginning, Platonic understanding, something that is a constraint on it.
Well, you always revert back to Platonism. I understand.
No,
right?
you brought in Plato. You brought in Plato, and I'm making the case that you're introducing Platonism again here, although you want to avoid it.
Very well. Well, I'm not a scholar of Plato as assuredly you, at least not as much as assuredly you are, what have you. But nevertheless, in my conception of erotic love, so to speak, or the erotic loving spirit, the erotic loving spirit imbibes into nature and all entities thereof a desire for longing, a desire for the internal need, to use a Nigerian phase, so to speak, Anders Nygren, right? Internal need for continued advancement. So how would that correspond to my contingency thesis or to constraint? Well, again, noting that constraint is historically derived through the historical lineage of entities or organisms, you could say, applying that to the erotic love constraints.
we are back with the probability space as more than just an undefined possibility, right? So there are constraints coming with erotic desire. Also, I want to mention my last word to it here is that the differentiation between so if you define desire as you did, you are actually really including lack again, and Gilles Deleuze would make a strong critique of that understanding of eros. It comes out of fullness that you want instead of lack. All right, so desire, need, and stuff like this is problematic for many reasons. Anyway, I want just to mention this. But thank you so much for your conversation with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tauber, for your questions. And of course, this is not at all a finished product, so to speak. This will be worked out over the course of years, and I hope you understand that. Indeed, yes.
It's evolution, right?
Exactly.
Thank you, Professor Faber. It's my pleasure now to introduce for his lines of questioning, Professor Ingolf Dahlfeldt.
Hello, Brad. Good to see you and have a conversation with you. Before you turn to your next book. So let me continue with my questions right where we left off a moment ago. The pouring out. I mean, it's a kind of pretty idiosyncratic use of the kenosis in the way you defined the term for yourself in this book, in your dissertation. Now, but I want to understand it more clearly what you mean by it. You talk about the pouring out of the spirit into matter, of the presence of God into everything that is present. And you say at one point towards the end of your dissertation that the idea is, and I quote from page 321, it's not only that she gives us love itself in the pouring out process, but also herself in the very act of love. Now, what exactly is being poured out in this case? I mean, it's not just love, you say, it is herself in the act of love. Could you explain what kind of point you're trying to make here?
Yes, indeed. Now, I think I'll go back, I'll refer you back to a notion sometime in, let me see where that was, but nevertheless, I somewhere in that dissertation indicated that the spirit who is love, of course, and I thought that was exactly the way I wrote it there. So I affirmed an equivalence of the spirit of God with the concept of love. And of course, going back to my notion of erotic love, I contend that the erotic creating spirit who is erotic love is vivified within the natural world. So then, to address your question most exactly, I think that both love, the erotic love of the spirit and the spirit are kenoted, so to speak, or that doesn't make sense, but are kenosis, so to speak, into the world. If that makes sense to you, sir.
So we have, in a sense, two things present there, love and the spirit.
Well, the spirit is love, as I formerly alluded to.
Okay, so the one is identical with the other. I mean, the pouring out of love is the pouring out of the spirit.
Bingo. Yes.
Okay. But then would you tell a biologist that she is actually studying God at work when she studies nature?
Yes, I would, in fact. Yes, I would.
So if biology sort of ignores the God question completely, is there something missing in biology? That goes back to the very first round of discussion we had at the beginning of our conversation.
I do think something's missing. However, as a method, but I go back to this distinction between methodological naturalism and supernatural, and of course methodological supernaturalism, so to speak, in that one can methodologically be a naturalist and still conduct science to a T, so to speak. But then, of course, they can't answer the uttermost questions, so to speak, Dr. Dalford. Does that make sense at all?
Well, I see what you're driving at, but I'm not quite convinced yet. And that's why I want to continue this line. Okay. You emphasize again and again that it is absolutely important for your kind of approach that we need, as you say, a thoroughly immanent God or none. So God has to be immanent.
All right.
And I have an inkling of what you want to say here, and you explain it in a number of different ways. But what is the scientist who studies nature? How does she find out about God if she studies nature? Because if God is all immanent, that kind of talk makes only sense against the transcendence of God. So could you kind of explain what you mean by God being immanent, thoroughly immanent, nothing but immanent, and still be distinct from the process of nature, from evolution, what evolution studies, and what we study when we study the world around us?
Very well. Great question, Dr. Dalford. Indeed, yes. Nevertheless, I would attempt to answer that question in what follows, which means then that I will assert that God's embeddedness within the world through the imbibification of the Spirit is present to all people, right? But methodological naturalists do not grant that evidence, so to speak, any merit. So but you can nevertheless, I contend, as a methodological naturalist doing biology, for example, you can productively do biology without the admission of the metaphysical supernaturalism, right? But I want to redirect here quickly that the notion of naturalism has undergone a great transformation in the last 200 some odd years thereabout. Naturalists used to refer to, of course, those who conducted their studies like Darwin did, in so much as you look at the data, then you discern the data, and then you of course postulate, I guess you could say, the hypotheses based upon that data that you collected. However, in the late modern world, naturalism has assumed merely a methodological sense of naturalism.
Yeah. That's an important part of the discussion. There is not one sense of naturalism. It changes over time in important respects, and depending on what kind of contrast we have in mind when we talk about naturalism. My interest is more on the divine side, or not the natural, as well the God side of the whole process, which is, of course, a central aspect of your dissertation. Now, at the very beginning of the dissertation, you quote Ord's view that we've talked about love, that love is one of the preeminent attributes of God's person. Do you understand God to be a person in some sense?
That was a metaphorical usage of the term person. What I meant by what I meant to connote by that usage of person was his individual, I guess, well, let me think about that, was the entity known as God, which of course I presuppose as being in relationship with other things, which I alluded to earlier in the dissertation, right? God is always in relationship. So God's person in this instance would be, I guess you could say, the Trinitarian aspects of God, right? Which is, I guess, established by relationship. But going back to your previous question here quickly, that being, nevertheless, did I adequately address your question there, Dr. Dalford?
Well, we are around the middle of discussing it, right? Okay. If God is, in some sense, you use the entity language more often than person language. If God is an entity, that obviously your idea is that there are different kinds of entities. There is a divine entity and there are non-divine entities, and there is a kind of relation between them. You are very strong. You are emphasizing this again and again. It's not that these entities, the non-divine entities, have been created in any serious sense, but they have been around all the time in certain ways. God is shaping, you say, but not creating matter. Why do you take this to be so obvious and evident and even necessary for your approach? why can't you say that God is the one who creates those whom he shapes?
Very good question, Dr. Dalford, indeed. Now, going back to my dissertation, I stipulate that the world and God necessarily exist alongside one another. That being the notion that I contend then that God forever exists in relationship, both in the Trinity as well as with an eternal world. So since God did not create this eternal world, but instead God only molds, shapes, or works with the eternal world that is alongside him the whole time. So that, again, that's almost definitional, I think, Dr. Dalford. Right.
Well, you define your terms in such a way. I'll come back to the definition issue in a moment. But let me first explore a little bit more about how you think the relationship with this God and world and the entities of the world. You don't like action language, you say. It is not action. It is activity. You prefer to talk about the activity of God. Yes. And then you explain the activity you have in mind in terms of the involvement, divine involvement. Mm-hmm. But I'm still not quite clear about what you mean by involvement here. In which sense is God involved in the world in such a way that he, as an entity of some sort, is active in that world?
Okay, very well. Well, I will first note that back in 2018, when we first met as a group to discuss I think it was the dissertation, my previous iteration of the dissertation proposal. I've got it on tape. I mean, I've got it on Zoom, what have you. You proposed that I use activity language over and above action language, right? Because I presented that to you three, in the context of divine involvement, right? So you proposed that activity language, and I incorporated it into my notion of involvement. But nevertheless, Dr. Dalford, why do I think that action language is wrong, I guess is what you're asking. I think action language connotes specific instances of acts by God, whereas involvement and activities are more nebulous in their reference. Therefore, they have no starting point and no ending point, so to speak, right? If I may use this reference for God, it refers to something that occurs over its entire lifetime, so to speak, right? Not merely punctilious in orientation.
Yeah. But aren't you actually using two images or models of a God and world that are not necessarily compatible, or obviously not compatible? One entity relates to another set of entities. Mm-hmm. And the other one is, there is a set of entities and there is an internal force, the immanent force that shapes those entities in a certain way, this totality. And you seem to be sort of, changing from one to the other in different parts of your dissertation. But what I would like to see is how you draw them together, these two ways of looking at the situation.
Right. Well, first, sir, I do not see the natural world, as I term it, or that is the entire the co-eternal or coexistent eternal world to be non-deistic or non-deist in a sense, right? Because I go back to my previous assertion with Dr. Faber. I contend that through some point in the infinitely remote past, that God imbibed himself through God's kenosis of the Spirit into the natural world, which eternally coexisted amongst them, right? So that tends to lead me to think then that there never was a time that the natural world existed as merely an opposing substance, so to speak. Again, this goes back to the thorough immanence of God throughout all entities in the world, or all entities in our known conception of the natural world. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, but why don't you go all the way and say, when God interacts with the world, against the backdrop of that picture you've been painting, God interacts with God's four earlier interactions and continues his interactions. It's not that there is a God, a divine entity, and non-divine entities, but rather there is. That's the point you repeatedly make, and I think you are right here. There is a continuity of both aspects at each moment of world history, as it were. There never was a time when there was a world without a God.
Okay.
And vice versa.
Right. Well,
that seems
I
to be
agree
the
with you.
thesis you are defending. And then you say, at one point, and I quote from page 310, not only that God could not be God without a world, but, and I quote, the world would be a mere chaos without a God with which it is in relationship. And this is precisely what I find a strange thesis, because a world without God would not be just chaos, it would not be. That's a difference.
That's an interesting point, Dr. Dalford. Indeed it is. I've got to think about that further. But you've drawn up a very, very important critique of my views, and I agree, and I see the logicality, so to speak, of your statement. Truly, I do. But let's see here. I was using, I guess you could say, that notion that the world will be mere chaos without God's relationship with it to be sort of a I guess a philosophical statement that without God to be in a relationship, it would be chaos. But since God has always, forever and a day, so to speak, been in relationship with the world has structure, order, and so forth like that. Does that make sense to you, Dr. Dalford?
Yeah, that brings me right to my next question here, because if we don't have to look for a causal joint, because that doesn't make sense against the backdrop of the picture you've been painting. You talk about God being fully present, or the divine spirit being fully present in the world, more exactly in, with, and under the natural world. That's the language you use. Mm-hmm. Now I'm asking, if I take that seriously, you are presenting us with a kind of a sacramental view of the world. But you never use sacramental language anywhere. I mean, you don't use the term sacrament or sacraments in any explicit way, as far as I can see. But you use sacramental language when you talk about the view of the world which you have. Can you explain this, why you use that language without going into the problem of sacraments?
Well, that's a very interesting question as well, Dr. Dalford. I love this line of questioning, but nevertheless, I chose not to use sacramental language, although I do agree that it is sacramentally oriented, I guess you could say, but I chose not to use sacramental language because I wanted to not overtly or overly, you could say, even in a sense, display my own Christian beliefs, so to speak. I wanted the science and the philosophy and my theology overlay to speak for themselves, but I didn't want to force, so to speak, onto that my sacramental imagery.
Well, that's why you refrained from using the term sacrament, but you didn't refrain from using the term kenosis, for example, which is, of course, you could apply the same type of question or argument even here as well. My question arising from this is, if you find God everywhere, that is the point of the picture you're painting. If you find God everywhere, which I think is right, then there is no study of reality that is not somehow studying God's presence at the same time as well. It's somehow related to this. And then in the question becomes, how can we sort of distinguish between a theological approach to the understanding of the natural world and a scientist, a biologist's approach? And you've made that in methodological terms. One practices in that a methodological atheism in a sense, and others and the theologians don't. But my question is that really the case? I mean, I find, to put it very briefly, that your dissertation at many places reads to me, it looks to me like a theology of stipulation. You stipulate the understanding of a certain term, and then you go on drawing certain conclusions from this. On page 260 following, it's particularly obvious. You write, for example, and I quote, I now stipulate that there is divine involvement through a creative synthesis of contingent events and the underlying laws of nature. And then you go on to I stipulate that there is a kenotic activity in the world. And then I stipulate, and you have 3, 4, 5 stipulations. Mm-hmm. And then you conclude, and I quote again, so then there is definite kenotic creativity throughout the world. You conclude from your stipulations that there is, in an ontological sense, obviously, or an even empirical sense to some extent, that reality. And I find this a difficult move, because you move from a definition of terms to a statement about reality. And there's something missing.
It's very interesting. And truly, your line of question is highly, I guess, erudite and somewhat informative to me. Truly it is. But nevertheless, I was working there with my earlier established views, and based on those earlier established, or rather on my earlier established theses throughout the previous part of that dissertation. So from that, I then stipulated this and that, so to speak, 3 or 4 times, as you put it there, right? Mm-hmm. Based upon my previous activity, so to speak, to use your language, in the previous sections of the book. So I admit that I do conclude based on my stipulations, but my stipulations are backed up on the meat of the preceding parts of the dissertation itself. Does that make sense at all, Dr. Dalford?
Yeah, and then these stipulations refer back to what you said earlier. That is the case. But there is, of course, a danger if you solve problems, or it's to a reader, to a naive reader like me, it looks at times that you solve problems by definition. You say there is no causal joint because there is always that two-sided process of a natural world and the divine spirit working in and through the natural world. Which is, I have no question about it. That's a tenable view from a theological point of view. But I find it difficult to establish it by argument, unless you start from certain premises, and they have to be tested out against what you find in nature and in the science, the study nature. And this is where I think you sometimes go too quickly from, the way you use your terms to drawing certain conclusions from this. And at the beginning, you raise a number of important questions that you want to address in your dissertation. And one question is, and I quote, why do we need a God idea at all? Why can't we study, all this without talking of God? And I'm still at a loss when I ask myself, what kind of answer did he give me to this question which he raised?
Well, Dr. Dalford, that question, in fact, goes back to our 2018 meeting, which you, sir, asked me, why do we need a God idea at all? What does biology add or what does biology add to theology, and conversely, what does theology add to biology that biology doesn't already explain? That was a quote by you, Dr. Dalford, that I incorporated in my dissertation.
Sure, but
right?
What is the answer?
What is the answer?
Yeah.
The answer.
So that question, why do we need a God idea at all?
Why do we need a God idea at all? Because God, again, as I assert throughout the dissertation, is the source or the derivation, you could say, of the potentialities in the world, of the potentialities in the world, in so much as because of his bestowal of himself through the kenosis of the Spirit into the natural world. All entities in the natural world are therefore imbibed by, so to speak, the Spirit. So that's why I need a God idea, because that, of course, as I illustrate throughout the dissertation, is the very embodiment of the evolutionary advance. That is because it is due to the primal imbibification. I'm going to stutter of that word. The primal imbibification of matter by spirit. Does that make sense? That's why we need a God idea.
Yeah, but you know, all the language you use and the examples you give and the way you develop your argument seems to move at the level of actualities of some sort. There's something actual. You know, you can only relate to something that is actual in the sense of interaction, etc. So you talk about things that are actual. What I find interestingly missing is a component of your dissertation that I find absolutely central to your whole argument, namely the distinction between possibility and actuality, and the relating what you say about God to possibility. If God is the one for whom all things are possible, it is possibility that is the primary sort of mode of talking about God's relationship. But you seem to go straight to actualities when you describe the situation. So what kind of, you know, how's your view about the relationship between possibility and actuality here?
That's a very interesting question again, Dr. Dalford. But nevertheless, I would like to refer back again to my introductory statements of the not presented today, but in the dissertation itself, that although we can conceive of all sorts of possibilities that may have occurred, for example, in the production of the natural world as we know it, only a few of those actual possibilities were ever probable to begin with. And then moreover, only one of those probabilities based on those possibilities ever were instantiated themselves.
All right. That is the conclusion you draw, obviously, and I see it. But why don't you conclude that there must be, for some reason, more than one actual world?
Why do I not conclude that there's more than one?
Yeah, because you assume from beginning to end that there is one world and that there is this, you know, the evolutionary process in which some, but not all, possibilities have been actualized, will be actualized. So there are always possibilities that have not been actualized. But if God is the one for whom all things are possible, why should he content himself with one world only?
Well, that's a very interesting question again. I do not posit that there is necessarily only one world. However, this is the world that we have to work with, not these possible ones. So I'm working in this dissertation with the one that we do have, right? But I do not deny that there are other possible worlds out there. And in fact, I think I intimate such in the dissertation itself. So then, but this is the one that we have today. I'm working with what we have. We can speculate all we want to on other possible existing worlds, but that means nothing, because this is the world we're in and this is the world that we work with. So I'm using the actuality of this world to base my conclusions on, which of course we've already established earlier in this conversation, Dr. Dalford.
But at least that indicates somehow, we could sort of go into this, but I won't, in which sense one could develop the idea of transcendence of God over against that immanent process which you describe in terms of the working of the Spirit. But I stop here and I come to an end of, you know, there are more things I'd like to talk about, but it's been interesting to read your dissertation. And I like open ends because they sort of make you think. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dalford. Indeed, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dalford. That was a fascinating line of questions, definitely. So it's standard for the chair to limit himself or herself to a shorter amount of time, since we've been talking intensely for at least 5 years. But I will take 14 minutes to ask a few questions. I'm going to need to leave out the technical PERS questions, but I do think that the PERS chapter is one where there were many potentialities that didn't get actualized, as you know, because you were leaving out chunks of it in the very last minute. I want to allow myself just one technical biology question. I think that this picks up Dr. Dalford's theme that there are a lot of stipulations and philosophical conclusions, but less experimental data than one might have expected. So here's one. I've actually written it out. Do you know Jonathan Losso's 2017 book, Improbable Destinies, Fate,
Yes,
Chance, and the Future of Evolution?
I do, yes.
You do not cite it in the bibliography or anywhere in the text. So what's fascinating about Losso's book is that is the empirical data he covers on the debate between Gould and Conway Morris. Several experiments, as he summarizes, several experiments in the lab demonstrate how closely related species tend to evolve similar adaptations to similar selection pressures, sometimes over the course of only a couple of generations. So that's the Conway Morris kind of data. But he then compares those to long-term evolution experiments developed in the last decades using E. coli and other microbes. After thousands of generations, one of these populations may evolve particularly unique traits unobserved in any of the others, such as the capacity of E. coli to metabolize citrate in the presence of oxygen. That is, given enough time, unpredictable and perhaps unique features may evolve and become predominant in that population. In short, we have empirical data for Gould and empirical data for Conway Morris. But as summarized by Tiago Simoes at Harvard, and this is a conclusion, an empirical conclusion, not a speculative one. Quote, it seems that the conflict between contingency and predictability is a matter of scale. Organisms tend to achieve similar solutions to similar problems, that's convergence, but given enough time or small enough population sizes, and anything is possible. That's Gould. The argument then is scale and also thousands of generations. Isn't that an empirical resolution, or at least empirical data that ought to influence philosophers of biology like yourself?
Well, Dr. Clayton, I first deny one of your opening statements, that being, or if you could reword that for me, I'd be greatly appreciative. You state that Lossos et al., of course, and they indicate that based on Richard Linsky's experimental evolutionary data of that microevolution, or rather, I should say, of the evolution of microbes, so to speak, that hints that widely divergent organisms could converge upon widely divergent organisms could converge on the same or the similar adaptations, so to speak. But I belie that, because again, even he is not making a distinction between parallelism and convergence that I earlier stipulated, that I perhaps did not do so effectively enough. Because even he, in that sentence that you quoted there, he says that loosely or distantly related species, which connotes by ipso facto, you could say, which connotes they had the same history of derivation somewhere back in the past. So then what he's actually explaining in that occurrence is parallelism, not convergence. Does that make sense?
That doesn't get at the real concern here. That the concern is that we have empirical evidence that the conflict between Conway Morris and Gould, as at the philosophical level, obscures clear empirical data that allow us to give scientific answers to this question. The philosophers get up into the metaphysical realms, but in the lab, this is not difficult. We can reconcile their two positions as a matter of scale, and exactly as I read in the closing quote by Simoes.
Well, again, I go back to the distinction between parallelism and convergence. And with regard to your reference to scale, well, parallelism will of course, based on previous genetic.
No, Bradford, no, you're giving me philosophy. You're giving me a conceptual distinction. I'm asking, what's the role of data? The scientists, the biologists on this call, and there are actually some in the audience, quickly becomes frustrated that philosophers spin stories when we have lab results.
Right.
What is the role of lab results in resolving some of the issues in biology in this dissertation?
What is
zero?
The result of lab results? Well, these lab results do often employ parallelism and not convergence. So
now you're giving me concepts. I want to know can data play no role in your philosophy of biology?
Sure, David. I'm empirically grounded, Dr. Clayton. Indeed, I am.
That's what I wanted to hear. You
But
got you on tape now.
but
All right.
the
Okay, I'm going to move on.
But of
I'm
course-
down to just a couple of minutes. That leads me to, admittedly, well, to the question of synthesis. So you claim that chapter 4, where Conway Morris is introduced, offers a synthesis, or you've said elsewhere that the positions of Conway Morris and Gould can be, or I think you said have been reconciled. You said in this conversation that you use Conway Morris to soften Gould.
Mhm.
But doesn't synthesis represent a higher standard? That you have a position A and a position B, and that you're able to formulate a position C that shows how the true parts of A and B are preserved, and false parts and dispensable parts are left behind. But as far as I can see in chapter 4, you don't actually offer synthesis in that way. You don't give us that argument. So in fact, aren't you just placing another position alongside Gould and Conway Morris, and the word synthesis should be dropped from your dissertation?
No, I don't think I'm doing that at all. Another position. Rather, I take elements from Conway Morris, and I take elements from which, of course, I go back to the assertion that I do not affirm all that Gould claims. I take elements from each of these guys. Again, that goes back to my opening statement. I'm not looking to defend them per se, because I only take elements from them. So I take elements from each of those people and then put them together in my own formulation. So I think that does constitute a synthesis.
Okay, my question is, should Gould and Conway Morris admit that your position is superior to either of theirs alone?
Yes, they should.
Then wouldn't you need to show why yours was superior from a philosophy of biology perspective over theirs?
Perhaps I need to, but I can't do that in this dissertation because of the space limitation. Right.
So actually,
Right.
since you are a published author, this seems like an important moment to say that there is a standard in a brilliant book, in an epoch-changing book, that it convinces a group of experts, here I'm alluding to Peirce's epistemology, in a particular field, that say your position is superior in the philosophy of biology to these other two competing positions. This kind of gets back to Dr. Dalfort's stipulation question. I would love to see fewer stipulations and more arguments. Conway Morris's position should be rejected for the following 3 reasons. Likewise for Gould, but the position I'm now advancing retains their strengths without their weaknesses, and therefore the entire community should acknowledge it as the stronger position. That mode of argumentation is the mode of a brilliant book, a Kant or so forth. And I think it would be lovely,
Well, I admit
your
that
incredible intellect, Bradford, it would be lovely to see books, say the published version of this one, striving for that higher standard.
that is an excellent point, Dr. Clayton. Truly.
Thank you. Then
But my
I'll move on.
stipulations,
Uh,
but my stipulations, I will again assert, are based on the previous work. But I didn't want to duplicate myself in stipulating that, because I referred you. I was
not
mentally
true.
referring you back to
Bradford, it's not true. You don't make the case for the superiority of your position over Conway Morris
Okay.
or Gould in the philosophy of biology anywhere in this dissertation.
Okay.
Contingency. I
Very well.
kind of
I
wonder
take that,
what-
and I appreciate your insight.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I'm having to be very concise here, but it's all right. Contingency. For Gould, isn't contingency just another word for chance?
Largely, yes, largely.
And
But
in
not-
chance, in chance in physics anyway, means randomness, like noise in a radio broadcast.
Yeah.
Do you hear me okay?
All I heard was in physics, randomness is noise and so forth, and then you cut out.
Yeah, exactly. And you use contingency theologically, quasi teleologically, but if it is pure randomness, then it doesn't actually lead you to theological conclusions.
That's a very good point, Dr. Clayton. Although I contend that I don't use a physics-based explanation of contingency or chance. Rather, I use a biological definition of chance, which is, of course, based on the contingency argument that I've gone ahead.
For the published version, we would need to see that in biology, contingency means something different than chance. And I don't think you've yet made that argument.
Okay, very well. Thank you.
On divine action, you use the concept of divine involvement, but you also want to say that God actually does something, most strongly in the closing 30 pages. Divine involvement, but can't I be involved in a Georgia State football game, say as I watch it on my television, without influencing the outcome?
Yes, you can. In fact, yes.
So
yes,
God could be a God could be a God of divine involvement without influencing the course of it at all.
But not the way that I use involvement. You can be involved in a spectator event. You know, of course, like all are involved in this discussion, although they're not actively contributing anything to it yet, besides you three doctors, but they're involved with it in a sense, right? But in the sense that I use involvement means that they are doing what you, Dr. Clayton, what you, Dr. Dalford, and what you, Dr. Faber, are doing, which means interacting with actual entities, that being me, of course, right? But these other spectators are in this dissertation defense, but they're not doing anything, right? Does that adequately address your concern there, Dr. Clayton?
Okay, well, we'll leave that on the recording and come back to it. I'm going to come to my final two questions. Unfortunately, I have to leave out a really important biology question. This is the work of C.H. Waddington, 1905 to 1975, the British developmental biologist who has had a strong influence on Conway Morris, as you know. And who's famous for the notion of canalization, right? That sometimes when there's convergence, well, overall, we know in Conway Morris's work, convergence and divine teleology are linked. For him as an evangelical Christian, those are, he's very careful about what he says in print, but he's not as careful in intervarsity meetings and so forth. But in biology, so Waddington, for example, gives his canalization is a Platonic answer, not a divine action answer. And this dissertation doesn't yet sort out these two genera of interpretation of convergence, the divine teleology angle and the Platonic canalization angle. It would be very important to sort those out before publication. Two final questions extremely briefly. Okay, this is hard. First, a dilemma for you in terms of divine influence, as you now in the final version argue it more strongly than you did 2 years ago. On the one hand, if you say God exercises of the four Aristotelian causes, all three except efficient causation, so material, formal, and final. If God exercises those three kinds of cause, then science will say, well, those aren't scientific explanations. We're about efficient causes. And therefore, you have theology and science in competition. On the other hand, if you say God does exercise efficient causation, in that sense, even in Aristotle, it overlaps with what we would call the scientific explanation. In that case, then God is in competition with science, because both theology and science are offering the same kind of explanations, which implies, for example, that there might be a causal joint. Is there an easy way around this dilemma?
Yes, there is. The linkage of final causation and efficient causation by Peirce is my answer to your putative problem there. In so much as Peirce purse, of course, links the two together, because one is a sheriff, for example, and then he uses this analogy exactly. One is the sheriff, whereas the other is the court, of meaning that efficient causality is the sheriff, and whereas the final causality is the court, because the court superintends what the efficient does, so to speak, or what the sheriff does. Does that make sense at all?
It does. Great. That's going to need to go into the Peirce chapter before it's published, because that argument is not yet spelled out in full detail. And the final question, maybe it's a yes or no question given the clock. It's about divine determinism. You spoke of today in the talk, in the responses, of, quote, an eschaton in the biblical sense. And I wanted to ask as my closing question, given the view of God and divine involvement that you've shared in the defense today and the document, can we know that God's goals will be actualized in the end? That is, that there will be an eschaton in the biblical sense.
In the biblical sense, no, but there will be an eschaton in which, so to speak, an end of things, or end of time, at least in a biological / philosophical sense, because even in a physical sense, you could say as well, that's physics based, in so much as this world that we're in now, or at least this earth that we're in now, is heading irrevocably toward destruction. Indeed, it is, because we are the universe is accelerating, and of course, and we are drawing closer and closer and closer to the sun. So in so much as, of course, the sun will eventually encompass the
yes, 4 billion
Earth.
years, but that's not
Right.
cosmology. Cosmology is current cosmology is the heat death of the universe, which means all matter at a few degrees above absolute zero, with no further interactions to speak of, no energy and no life in any sense we'd understand it. So that would not be anything like an eschaton. It's a burnout scenario. Okay, anyway, so it will be interesting to reconcile some of the language, which is more traditionally Christian, and then the language that you've given us, the more radical language, your flirtation with pantheism, your difficulty in establishing transcendence in response to Dr. Delfert, or even what type of entity is God, if God is an entity at all. Those questions would need to be resolved so that the reader sees the kind of theology implied by this book. Currently, she might be forgiven for not seeing that with complete clarity. Thank you so much for humoring these final questions. I'm going to move us quickly into breakout rooms. All of you can congratulate Bradford on his brilliant performance, and we'll be calling you back in a few minutes for the conclusion of this dissertation defense. Please click on the screen in front of you, and you'll be in a breakout room, all of you, very shortly. And I will help by inviting you in. And then I will pause. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure now to introduce to you for the first time, Dr. Bradford McCall.
All right.
Congratulations.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you all for being here as well. All right.
I don't think so.
Got tears of joy.
Oh,
Yeah, there should be. There should be. It's been a long journey, Bradford. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'll ask everyone to mute just for 2 minutes, and Professor Delfert and then Professor Faber will make a quick comment. Then we will make Bradford the host of the meeting, and let you congratulate him after the committee leaves. Professor Delfert.
Well, Bradford, congratulations. That was a great defense. We enjoyed having that conversation
you.
with you. And we would have liked to continue for another 3-4 hours. but we were interrupted by the chair, and therefore we have to stop here. But it's been an interesting dissertation you have written. I think there's a lot of material, a lot that could be elaborated, and we think you have done quite well in drawing all this together. There are a number of things which I think you want to polish up before publication. And we've touched on most of these or many of those points in our conversation. I'm sure you have taken note of what you want. If there is one thing I wish to see in the final version of your book is get clearer about your talk about God as entity and how that relates to the rest of the world. Because I find at the very end of the dissertation, you make an important distinction which could help to get the whole thing even clearer than it is right now. Namely, the distinction between that's on page 323 between the that of something and the how of something. The that is necessary, you say, but the how is that is free. And I think if you put a lot of what you say into the mode terminology, mode language, that would be an interesting way of even going beyond what you have presented here. So congratulations, it was a great dissertation and we enjoyed having that conversation with you.
Thank you, Dr. Dalford.
Thank you.
And for me, Dr. McCall now, right? So I'm happy for you to be at this point, and I'm pleased with your way to converse about your own thesis and your kind of universe in your mind. I would love to be in conversation with you about certain issues in the future, since you have a great knowledge. But so if there's one thing, to be short, that I would like, I was asked to say one thing at least, it is you need to create this fact. I don't want you to change really anything, just do it, make it as such, but you got to go beyond it. You got to go clear up the whole question of Platonism that is unclear in your whole work, how the causations work together, how there is the relationship also between origin and aim, how there is the whole question of possibility and potentiality is unclear. And I don't want to go into Whitehead, but like he tried to do that, to clear it up in a sense. You are totally, so to say, in swimming within a kind of Platonism, uncleared, and you need to kind of dig deeper to get this to the surface and think about it. You need a wider horizon. You need to let go of certain elements that you have created that you kind of reiterate and take a fresh look, not for this book, but after that, just turn around and go beyond that. I would love to see that.
Thank you, Dr. Dalford. And by the way, I do plan on extending the fundamental, I guess you could say, the core of this dissertation in numerous publications in the future, of which my CV attests, and which I also cited several.
I'm asking you not to extend it. I'm asking you to go beyond it. You have to kind of turn around and think anew, in order to get a different horizon by which you can look back on your work and widen your universe in a sense.
Gotcha. Thank you, Dr. Faber. Yes.
Good. And Bradford, we will be talking over the coming weeks in detail about how to finish this off and submit the work and complete the process of the doctorate. But you are now authorized to use the name doctor on all correspondence and require all friends to call you Dr. Bradford from here on out, as of this moment. So we do have some work to take care of, but we'll do that over the coming weeks. And I want to express just the joy it has been to work with you as a colleague and a friend, and to watch you deepen and deepen and deepen the quality of the arguments that you bring. I wanted my few questions to, very similar to what Dr. Faber just did, to have you think about a divine eros that might bring you from a current way of thinking to one that's deeper and broader, more all-encompassing, that brings the ambivification yet a few steps further on, in ways and concepts that haven't yet touched you in the erotic, but also the conceptual way. And for us, of course, those two are not ultimately separate. You are now co-host, and the committee will leave. And I hope that others will stay on for a few minutes to congratulate you wildly as your host of this meeting. We'll be in touch. Again, thank you to the guests for joining, and our congratulations to Dr. Bradford McCall for completing a quest that goes back some 26 years of his life. Congratulations.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Ingolf, and thank you, Roland. Yes, thank you.
All right. Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Goodbye.